Attention, respect, ready. In this lesson, we're going to look at the back stance and the cat stance. The strength and effectiveness of our hand techniques is derived from the solidness of our stance. First of all, the back stance. In the back stance, we want to have our feet at right angles with our heels pretty much on the same line. I want to have 60% of the weight on my back leg, 40% on the front. My back leg should be bent enough that I can't see my toes. My front leg slightly bent. My torso up and down, vertical. I don't want to tilt this way, that way, back or front, but straight up and down with eyes on the target. From the other direction, or we could be here or here. Again, with the back stance, 60% of the weight on my back leg, 40% on my front. My feet are at right angles, back leg bent so I can't see my feet, front leg with a slight bend, my torso vertical, both heels on the floor and eyes on the target. One of the best ways to practice the back stance is by walking drills. By putting the stance in motion, we're preparing for kata. So, notice that I moved backwards as well as forward in my practice. It's important to practice this backwards because we need to be able to get out of the way. So let's look at the back stance from a couple of kata sets. In kata, our aim is perfect technique. So I'm going to start with the second half of Chunji, the first kata most of our students learn. So I look to the left, bring my hand to the opposite hip, block into a good back stance. I want to expel my air so that my breath is coordinated with the block. So again, from here, and from that stance, I'm going to go into a reverse punch. That punch is called a reverse punch because I'm punching with my back hand. In order to do a good reverse punch, our fist has to be in the right position. So let's take our hands, roll our fingers in, with the thumb on top, squeeze, turn your hand over, and this should be a straight line. I don't want it like this, but like this. The whole idea is to make contact with these front two knuckles. If we make contact with the back knuckles in a real life situation where we're hitting a target, we're likely to break those knuckles back there or break our fingers. The idea is to hit with the two strong knuckles, the front two knuckles. Again, it's a reverse punch because I'm punching from my back. So, in this case, I'm stepping into the front stance using a circle step, but I'm pushing off of my back leg with that back stance. So that back stance is setting up my reverse punch. From Chunji. We're going to look at another basic kata, solid stance 1. In solid stance 1, the back stance is modified slightly. In the classic back stance, remember my heels are on the same line, but in the classic back stance, my feet are going to be wider apart. And the reason is that I'm turning into a front stance, unlike Chunji, where I used a circle step to get there. So from solid stance 1, what I'm doing is I'm using that back foot to push off, turning my hip into the punch. So that back stance is setting up the reverse punch. How solid my reverse punch is dependent upon my back stance. There's another component of that, and that's pulling your hand back hard. So many things work together to make that technique, the reverse punch, effective. Set up from the back stance, and fully engage your hip, punch through your first two knuckles, bringing your opposite hand back as hard as you can. Solid stance one. We encounter the back stance in many of our katas. Let's look at Yol Gup. In Yol Gup, I'm using a classic back stance, and the back stance is setting up the knife strikes. The effectiveness and strength of the knife strikes depends upon the solidness of the back stance. Again. So I'm ending my breath, I'm breathing out, coordinating my breathing so that I'm exhaling my air. At the same time, I'm finishing the punch, or the strike in this case, and I'm pushing off from that back stance from the back leg to get more power. So again, in kata practice, we're practicing perfect technique, and you can go through a lot of katas and work on your back stance. Another one where we go from side to side, of course, is Farang. Let's look now at some self-defense combinations. In self-defense, our goal is perfect aim. Remember, kata was perfect technique. In kata, we're visualizing our uke. Another way of saying that is keeping our eyes on the target. In self-defense, in class, normally we practice with an uke for perfect aim. And if you're fortunate enough to have someone else in your family taking karate, you have an uke to practice with. Those of us that don't need to visualize our target or visualize our opponent. So with the back stance, first of all, I'm getting out of the way as I move into the back stance. Notice how far I can move to get out of the way. If I move far enough, I really don't even have to block. So we're going to look at several combinations with the back stance that you might use on a green belt test. The first is a blue belt combination where we're using an opposite hand technique for the entry technique. So I'm going to block, use my opposite hand, and then do a finishing blow. So what I did was I blocked, did a 4-knuckle punch with the opposite hand and a cross-step kick. Again. So in the next level of self-defense techniques, we use a same hand for our entry technique. In this case, we're going to use a closed punch and then a vertical back fist. So in that technique, my vertical back fist is coming down on my elbow is coming down on my opponent's arm, and I'm using the back stance to engage my hip and twist into the vertical back stance. In the next round of techniques, we use a kick as our entry technique. So in that case, I'm doing a side kick to the knee. The finishing blow, of course, is my reverse punch. So again, I have my eyes on the target. I'm coordinating my breathing. and I'm using that back stance to set up the next technique. So again, kata was for perfect technique, self-defense, perfect aim, but the back stance is critical in sparring where we're looking at perfect motion. So in sparring, a back stance is really critical. I usually start a sparring match with my side to my opponent, and I want to be facing front, exposing so much of my torso. And my technique as I spar is to always get back so that I'm not exposing that torso. I start in a back stance, but notice I'm not going to be way back here. I want to be able to move quickly. So in this back stance, I usually have my legs a little bit closer together. So the back stance can be used to cover distance. Notice that I'm pushing off of that back leg from the back stance to cover distance, sliding my back foot along. One of my favorite techniques as a counterattack is a reverse punch from a back stance. So I'm going to block and turn into that reverse punch. Notice that I'm bringing my hand down to guard my head. I'm not leaving it up in the block. I'm using the back stance to push off and twist my hip into the reverse punch. The back stance is used to set up many offensive combinations as well. So I might do a back fist, reverse punch, and a ridge hand. After the back fist, I'm going to have my hand up guarding my head. I'm using that back stance to fully engage my hip into the reverse punch. I might do a ridge hand from the opposite side. So again, the back stance is critical to our karate. It's important that we practice our perfect technique in kata, perfect aim in self-defense, and motion, offensive and defensive in sparring, using the back stance to set up the next technique. Another offensive combination I might do from a back stance ends with a turning side kick. So I'm doing a back fist, reverse punch, turning side kick. That back stance, pushing off from that, enables me to engage my hip into the reverse punch and set up the turning side kick. Again, so we've looked at a back stance in kata, self-defense, and sparring. The back stance again, 60% of my weight on my back leg, 40 on my front, heels on the floor, feet at right angles, my back knee bent so I can't see my feet, front knee slightly bent, torso or body vertical, eyes on the target. So now let's look at a cat stance. A cat stance is basically a ready to kick technique. In the cat stance, we have our feet at a 90-degree angle as well, like the back stance, but my feet are going to be much closer together. The reason is I want to have 90% of my weight on my back leg. In this case, my back heel is on the floor, but my front heel is not. My toe is on the floor. So if I'm in a good cat stance, I should be able to pick up that front leg without shifting my weight. So again, a ready to kick position. 90% of the weight on your back leg, 10 on your front. So let's look at this first from quick form 1, the first basic kata that we run across a cat stance. So from ready position, I'm going to turn into that cat stance. Notice that I don't move my feet around, I simply turn into it. What I'm doing is I'm going to look at my target, bring my hand to my opposite hip, use my hips to engage the block and turn into it. Again, I'm pulling my hand, my opposite hand back to my hip. So that would be in quick form 1. In quick form 1, we're actually going to use that cat stance to set up what we call a falling step. So when I'm fully committed and in that cat stance, I'm in essence falling into that reverse punch, and I should be able to have a very long stance in that. So my goal would be to lengthen my stance using that cat stance to set it up. Notice that my hips are pressed underneath me. I'm not leaning this way. To avoid leaning in that, part of the secret is to bring your opposite hand back to your hip hard. Okay, so from a quick form 1. Let's also look at it from 1-2. So in 1-2, if I'm doing my cat stance properly, I should be able to snap my kick and put it down wherever I want to. So I'm in a challenge position, vertical back fist or vertical elbow, turn around into a cat stance, snap my kick, reverse directions, kick. So again, from 1-2. So again, in kata, I'm looking for perfect technique. Using that cat stance or ready to kick position in quick form 1 to set up a reverse punch, and in 1-2 to set up a kick, a defensive front kick. So again, perfect technique in sparring. I also use the cat stance in self-defense. So with the first series for blue belt, using the hand opposite of the block for the entry technique. So I'm blocking into a knife strike, and then I'm using that cat stance to set up the next technique, which is a reverse punch, stepping forward, horizontal elbow as a finishing blow. Notice that my foot is still in the cat stance position when I move into the horizontal elbow. So that's an opposite hand technique. I could do a same hand technique. Finishing with a slightly different kind of elbow, still horizontal, but coming from the other direction. So this time I'm using a knife hand strike palm up as my entry technique. So in the next series of self-defense techniques, I want my entry technique to be a kick. I'm going to use the side snap kick from One-Two. So I'm going into a cat stance covering ground to set up that snap side kick to the inside of the knee. When I was using a kick in the back stance, I was coming from the other direction, assuming in both cases a right hand punch. So my side kick was to the outside of the knee, this time to the inside. So again, 3 basic combinations from the cat stance that you could use on your green belt test, where you're practicing perfect aim. Since I don't have an uke here, I have to visualize the uke, have my eyes on the target, my breathing coordinated, and make sure that my aim is where it needs to be. If I visualize the target appropriately, my aim will be where it should be. Okay, the cat stance is also useful in sparring. So if we start out in our modified back stance with our side to our opponent, and I'm being rushed, what I like to do is to pull back into a cat stance and use it to send a message to my opponent, you better back up. My target is right above the belt, and I'm hitting with the ball of my foot. So I want to pop that defensive front kick from the cat stance or ready to kick position to my opponent. Again. So we've looked at both the back stance and the cat stance in kata, self-defense, and sparring, remembering that the importance of the stance is to effectively set up a punch or a strike, and the effectiveness of our hand technique and the strength of it depends upon the solidness of the stance. Again, a back stance, 40% of my weight on my back, 60% of my weight on my back leg, 40% on my front, both heels on the floor. For a cat stance, I'm pulling my feet in a little closer, my toes are on the floor, my heel is off in the front foot, and I'm able to raise my foot up and down without shifting my weight.